Where did it really begin? For African Americans everywhere, there is an important and unknown part of history, one that's never been told. It surrounds the discovery of the New World, this place we call America. I'm Jason Allen Carvell, and before there were dreams of equal freedom in Philadelphia, free Africans had already created a more perfect union in Spanish Florida. This is our story, the history of African American people as key players in the first America. This is America's untold journey. Our story begins 40 years before Jamestown. His name was Pedro Menendez. By 1565, he had been Captain General of the Spanish treasure fleets for 15 years. A powerful man and a confidant of the king, his plan was to come to Florida and build a colony. He left Spain with 12 ships and made his way to Florida, landing there on September 8th. It was here that he and Spain began the enterprise of Florida and America.
During the 16th century, Spain considered Florida, La Florida, to extend from the Keys all the way up to the Chesapeake Bay and west to the Mississippi River. That was Florida. And it was Spanish territory, and they did not want any of the other European nations trying to colonize it or explore it or exploit it.
The New World was built by three groups: the Europeans, the indigenous, and the Africanos. And that without any of those three, this would not have happened.
African men and women, both free and enslaved, participated in every single Spanish conquest expedition of the 16th century.
The first people of African heritage who came to the Americas, both here in the United States and in Latin America, were free. They were soldiers, they were conquistadors, they were sailors and wives.
We do see free Africans who are primarily African seafarers. African seafarers from the early 1400s were utilized by the Europeans to navigate up and down the west coast of Africa.
In fact, Juan Ponce de Leon's 1513 expedition carried 2 free blacks on that expedition, one of whom was a gentleman by the name of Juan Garrido.
When I was little, I read encyclopedias for fun. I started with A, and I would go to Z, and then I would start again. I never knew there were black conquistadors. I never knew that he went on to fight with Cortez in Mexico. I never knew that he is credited with introducing wheat to North America.
The colonists had a tremendous stake in this particular venture called the Enterprise of Florida. They were all invested, whether they were commoners that had a skill or whether they were the nobility that were going to be the leaders of the colony.
And so your Africans here as free men were here just like any other colonists anywhere else in the world. They were trying to make a better place for themselves. And in that, they were all working toward a common goal.
They're not just doing labor tasks. We see them in really critical roles. They are skilled. They're what we might refer to today as engineers. They're skilled workers and artisans.
Many of the farmers, the people of African descent, brought food and the knowledge of food that will grow in the tropics. West Africa is essentially on the same latitude as this part of the country.
The free blacks became shopkeepers and merchants and skilled artisans and craftsmen. In other words, what makes the colony function?
They were also skilled translators and interpreters, often acting as key negotiators with Florida natives. The very first interpreter in Spanish Florida worked directly for Pedro Menendez, and his name was Juanillo.
Juanillo was a black Spaniard who was the interpreter for the first settlement, and he had been shipwrecked in Florida some years before and ended up as a captive, a slave. And Menendez rescued him and brought him to the colony, and he got a place in the militia and became the interpreter.
They owned property, just as did other Europeans. And often you have examples of free blacks owning property in areas, parts of town, very close to the plaza, that were not simply limited to the colonial white elite.
The interesting thing about Spanish race relations in the 16th and 15th century is that they wouldn't necessarily have identified a black Spaniard as an African or a black. There was a wide range of skin color, and they were Spaniards first.
In Spain, you were judged by two things: whether you were Spanish and whether you were Catholic. If you were on one level, and if you were born in Spain. If you weren't, you were on another.
Indeed, the Spanish did have a very rigid class system. Africans and other non-Spaniards living in Spanish Florida were mostly thought of as second-class citizens by Spanish noblemen, regardless of whether they were free or enslaved.
It's really only recently that the general public has been made aware that St. Augustine precedes Plymouth Rock and Jamestown.
The first European settlers in Spanish Florida were from Spain. They were racially diverse, socially diverse. You had Portuguese, Germans, Italians. We know now that there were North Africans from Morocco and Tunisia.
If you walked the streets of St. Augustine at the time of Jamestown, you probably would have heard 7 different languages, including languages from West Africa.
When America's untold journey continues, the oldest documents recorded in America reveal the truth about the first settlers to the New World. We now return to America's untold journey, and the oldest recorded documents in America reveal the truth about the first settlers. This is the archives of the Diocese of St. Augustine. Inside its walls are the oldest American documents in the United States. It is here where researchers like Dr. Francis gain insight into America's first colony and its multi-ethnic beginnings.
Something you notice immediately going through the parish records is how often you see marriage unions between Spaniards, other Europeans, and Africans.
Hidden for centuries in the archive records are scenes like this Spanish colonial wedding.
It's ubiquitous in the records. They're everywhere from the early period all the way through to the 18th century. There are large numbers of unions between predominantly, of course, African women and European men.
While these interracial marriages largely occurred between Spanish soldiers and others who didn't have noble bloodlines to protect, it would still be some 400 years later that these same marriages would need to get Supreme Court approval in order to be accepted in all 50 of the United States. Part of the main mission given to the St. Augustine colonists was to spread the Catholic faith in the New World. This document dates back to 1606. It notes the baptism of a free black child in Spanish Florida, 1 year before Jamestown was founded.
You mentioned that we have those sacramental records of baptisms of blacks and Indians and such. It was just sort of, if I can say, the normal course of the events, because this was the responsibility that the Spanish colonists were given, and they took it seriously.
By the late 1600s, the colony of St. Augustine had been in existence for nearly a century. It was a thriving, multiracial, multicultural society. But this version of Spanish Florida was never supposed to have existed.
In 1565, Pedro Menendez de Avilés signed a contract with the Spanish crown. In that contract, Menendez was assigned to bring 500 slaves to Florida, with the idea that those slaves would work on developing a sugar plantation economy for Northeast Florida. Now, that economy never unfolded. Menendez never brought 500 slaves to Florida. In fact, in the entire first Spanish period, there are never 500 slaves in Spanish Florida.
St. Augustine certainly had its share of slaves, but newly discovered documents show that during these early years, the slave owners were as mixed as the slaves themselves.
Here in St. Augustine, among the Spaniards, there were white slaves, galley slaves, people who had committed a crime and were sentenced to 5 years in the galley. They were slaves then.
Anyone could be a slave. Christian, Jew, Moor. You could be enslaved and likely would be enslaved if you were captured in warfare, for example. You could be a punishment, but it was not considered a status into which you were born.
Most of the slaves that were brought to Spanish Florida were domestic slaves or royal slaves who had very specific, highly refined skills.
African women, for example, you see them performing tasks as domestic servants. You also see an African woman in the late 16th century, early 17th century, who serves really as the first nurse in the hospital of Santa Barbara in St. Augustine.
By the mid to late 1700s, their mission of keeping La Florida to themselves had failed, and a plantation economy took root in the Carolinas. For blacks, there were now two Americas, one English, one Spanish, and the difference between them could not be more striking.
First thing we have to understand is that the Spanish and the English had two very different ideas for North America.
The English tried to colonize North America with, at first, indentured servants and a promise of 7 years of labor. And what they will find is being a slave for 7 years might as well be a lifetime, and half of them will die. And that the first slaves in North America were actually Native Americans, and that the people working the fields as unfree people in Jamestown were red, black, and white.
Once the English began to say that our survival depends upon this stable labor supply, there was nothing that was, quote unquote, out of bounds in terms of their morality as well, because it all came down to their survival. This is how we are going to live and survive.
Slaves had guaranteed rights under Spanish legal codes. Families, for example, were not to be separated.
You yourself would know that if you lived under a system where your family could be broken up and sold for sale, if you have that fear that your child could be sold, that is a true definition of chattel slavery.
Slaves were not ignorant. By far, they did not live in a vacuum. They were well aware of the world and the surroundings around them. They just did not have the ability to change it.
And there are plenty of instances throughout St. Augustine's early history where slaves petition, they lobby, they sue, often successfully for freedom.
Now, the Spanish did not shy away from large-scale, ruthless enslavement. Prior to colonizing Spanish Florida, their conquest approach to colonization included large-scale destruction, mass murder in the Caribbean, Mexico, and Latin America.
So while it is true that Spanish Florida slaves had pathways to freedom, it would be wrong to think or believe that slavery under Spanish rule was somehow better than the unending brutality African slaves endured under British or American rule.
When we return, Carolina slaves hear about a better life in Spanish Florida and risk their lives for a chance at freedom.
Slaves head south in search of freedom, and with them comes war as America's untold journey continues.
In 1687, the first group of people arrived in St. Augustine as what would have been called fugitives. They had escaped bondage from the English plantations in the Carolinas.
Slaves understood that there was a relationship with La Florida that African descendants had, unlike any other area.
In some ways, this posed a threat to the Spanish regime here, and in some cases, a tremendous opportunity.
In 1693, the immediate threat for Spain was England and her growing Carolina colonies. As word got back to Spain that plantation slaves were seeking asylum in Spanish Florida, the king saw an opportunity, and with a stroke of a pen, made his first move.
The King of Spain created the Edict of 1693, which to my knowledge and other scholars appears to be the first civil rights legislation in the New World.
The Spanish policy in Florida of giving sanctuary to people who escaped slavery in the Carolinas wasn't completely altruistic. Of course, they knew that that would aggravate the British, it would disrupt their economy.
So anytime one country had an opportunity to, I guess in a sense, stick it to another country, they would do it.
As soon as the word got to the plantations in Carolina that there was this possibility of sanctuary after 1693, and that was really only 10 years after Charleston was founded, but immediately many people took advantage of that possibility to try and make it to Florida.
If you think about the Underground Railroad, most of what you learned in history is that the Underground Railroad went north up into Canada.
It is a part of U.S. history that's just not well known. The first Underground Railroad runs south. It runs south to St. Augustine, not north.
No matter how well you were being treated by Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so on a plantation, if you raised a child, you would look at that baby and say, I want something different for them.
The first group of people to make it to St. Augustine in 1693 included a woman with a nursing baby.
At this time in U.S. history, the country as we know it today does not yet exist. The South was a largely untamed wilderness with few roads and little refuge from the elements, and no real method of communication. The first telegraph system was still 150 years in the future.
How do people on a plantation hear that you can find freedom in Spanish Florida? It might help or it might not matter to you that from Charleston to St. Augustine is 377 miles.
When you leave the plantation, what are you leaving with? What's on your back? And you are just out there through the grace of God that you can make it.
You want to talk about heroics? This is heroism.
It was clear by the mid-1700s that once you got to the St. Johns River, then you were good.
In the Carolinas, Georgia, or as far north as New York, we have runaway slaves from Virginia and New York trying to make their way to St. Augustine, really beginning at the end of the 17th century and then in earnest in the 18th century.
They will feel at home because they will see people that look like them being successful. Entrepreneurs, farmers, people putting food on their tables, feeling the benefits of their own labor.
While its Spanish history is well known and celebrated, there was a time when St. Augustine's African history was hidden or dismissed entirely as myth.
I came here with my family 10 years ago, 2 teenage boys and my wife, and our first stop was the Castillo de San Marcos. And one of the park rangers said to me, "Sir, if you find this interesting, you should go to Fort Mose." And I said, "Really? Why?" And he said, "Well, this is my best effort to explain what it is." He said, "It's the first settlement of free people of African descent in North America." And I said, "What?"
Growing up here in St. Augustine as a child, I used to hear some of the older generation would talk about, well, we had a fort too. And you kind of wonder, well, is this really true, or is this just something that they're just saying to be saying?
I'm not hearing about Fort Mose until I have 2 kids in college, and I had studied history my entire life.
When I was in a history class at Florida A&M University, the history professor asked us where we were from, and he asked me, had I ever heard of Fort Mose? And I said, "No, sir."
Why has this story not come out? I would have loved to have heard about it when I was a kid. It would have completely changed my outlook on life.
The effort to rediscover Fort Mose fell upon University of Florida archaeologist Dr. Kathy Deegan and Dr. Jane Landers of Vanderbilt University. It would be a challenging task.
At the time, it wasn't accepted very widely in St. Augustine. And there were concerns that we were doing revisionist history and trying to revise St. Augustine's history, and that we were making things up, planting artifacts, and just because we wanted it to be.
Before you knew it, my family and I were in the car on the way to Fort Mose, and when we got there, what we discovered was it was basically a parking lot with a sign waiting to happen.
But we felt it was really critical that we find unequivocal pieces of the fort itself, the moat, the parapet, and so on. And so we really concentrated on the architecture, because we just had to be able to show that, yes, it's here, it's in St. Augustine, and it is Fort Mose, it matches the maps.
I looked in the back seat and I told my two teenagers, I said, we're not leaving here until you can tell me why this place is important.
When we come back, a colonial war erupts, and newly freed slaves fight to preserve their newfound freedom. And the French nuns who would change the fate of post-Civil War slaves.
And others.
And they would have been at odds with each other at that time if they were back in the homeland.
Most of the people spoke some English and Spanish and their African languages. So it was really rich in that way.
I think something truly remarkable happens in that a sense of community begins to grow.
Fort Mose and the town of Mose were not just an isolated place on the frontier.
They immersed themselves into Spanish culture.
They were connected regularly with St. Augustine.
They not only immersed themselves, but they actually thrived.
You would have had people that perhaps went into town to sell some of their wares. You would have had blacksmiths and carpenters who might have been involved in public works projects or had hired their time out.
The men of Mose were part of the Spanish militia of the town.
They became the first line of defense for St. Augustine, and in that process, they earned themselves also what we would consider citizenship.
The Mose militia was armed, outfitted, and trained by the Spanish army.
By forming a militia of former slaves, what better first defense could you have against former masters?
They forged alliances with Florida natives to form scouting parties. These forward scouting missions were critical in order to alert St. Augustine of any British invasion.
And that's the part that I'm impressed with, is that they felt that it was an honor for them to help defend La Florida.
This was a story not about slavery, but that the Fort Mose story is a story about freedom.
His name was General James Edward Oglethorpe, governor of Georgia for the British Empire. Stationed in Savannah, he, like his counterparts in England, was spoiling for a fight with the Spanish.
The British really demanded and wanted what they considered their property back. And the Spanish position was, with an edict from the king, that people would be given sanctuary and, if they converted to Catholicism, eventual freedom. And that really was a burr under the English saddle.
Oglethorpe, well, he felt that, well, he outnumbered the Spanish probably 2 to 1, 3 to 1, and he could come down and absolutely just sort of blow them away.
In June 1740, a force of 170 men from the Georgia Colonial Militia, the Scottish Highlander 42nd Regiment, and Carolina Rangers headed due south. Backing them were numerous support troops and 7 ships from the British Royal Navy. Their objective was to destroy Fort Mose and then blockade Matanzas Bay. If successful, the British could essentially starve the town and its inhabitants into submission.
But Oglethorpe's plan of a surprise attack on Fort Mose didn't unfold as planned.
The Spanish scouts, probably some from Fort Mose, had advance word that they were coming, and they were able to leave the Fort Mose area and regroup at the Castillo.
Having made a tactical retreat to the heavily fortified Castillo de San Marcos, the residents of Fort Mose and the townspeople of St. Augustine were able to hunker down behind the fort's 16-foot thick walls. It was here that they waited for supply ships to arrive from Cuba. It would be a long wait.
The entire town has been blockaded. The townspeople have been under bombardment for 27 consecutive days. They are essentially surrounded. Supplies are low, food is low, ammunition is low. Greatly outnumbered, the odds could not have been more against them.
On June 26th, a multi-ethnic strike force of Spanish regulars, Mose militia, and Florida natives launched a pre-dawn raid to retake the remains of Fort Mose from Oglethorpe's troops. This engagement would come to be known as the Battle of Bloody Mose.
They caught them at night, when they were sleeping, and totally surprised them. So I think that's one of the reasons that Oglethorpe lost as many men as they did lose during that battle.
The English suffered more casualties and retreated. They were defeated, and I think the Spanish troops got off fairly easily in comparison.
It appears that historically, the first major defeat of the British Army in the New World occurred here at Fort Mose.
But the glory of that day did not reverse Spain's ever-shrinking hold on Spanish Florida. And by 1821, Spanish rule had ended as Florida became a United States territory, ushering in an era of chattel slavery. For the Africans who lived there, it was no secret that the freedoms written in the Constitution would not apply to them. But with the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the surrender of the South, newly freed slaves in and around St. Augustine quickly gathered themselves on the west banks of the Maria Sanchez River to create Little Africa. Although they were skilled farmers, widespread illiteracy was certain to condemn them and their children to a life of hard poverty. Overcoming this would require outside help. A simple letter will forever alter the lives of the newly freed slaves in post-Civil War America as America's untold journey continues.
Very dear Lord Superior, after long reflection, weighing carefully and praying to God for His grace and light, I am writing to you to ask you to make all necessary arrangements in order to send a colony of your sisters under the protection of Father Gauthier in the month of April. I wish you to understand and clearly that it is for the blacks and for them alone that I have the sisters of your order come to my diocese. I have between 5,000 and 6,000 blacks without education and without religion or baptism for whom I would like to do something.
We came in 1866 at the request of Bishop Augustin Verreau. He asked for 8 sisters that would come. They had about 160 that volunteered, but the General Superior had already selected about 8 sisters that would come. And their ages ranged really probably from about 45 to probably 19, 20 years old. And he made it very clear that they were coming to teach the liberated slaves, that would be their work here. When they started to teach here, they taught children, and only boys came to school originally. But it wasn't too many weeks later, though, that the little girls started to come too. The parents would send the children, and at night we taught the adults.
Despite their good works, it wasn't long before the sisters were caught in the rising tide of racial segregation.
It was illegal to teach black people. So there was a lot of animosity about, educating black people, even after the Civil War, even after they were freed. In 1916, 3 of our sisters were arrested, and it was on Easter Sunday, and they were arrested over at St. Benedict's. The sisters were over there probably for Sunday school, after church services. The order to arrest them probably came from the governor, who was very anti-Catholic. So that went on for a week or two, but the end result was that that law was lifted from the books.
These noble sisters became revered by the people they were sent to help.
The first nun who died here, the black ladies from the cathedral parish, it wasn't the cathedral then, from parish of St. Augustine here, they took over the funeral. They said, these women came for us. We're going to take care of this funeral. And they did. Her body was laid out here at the Mother House. They organized a procession down the street and led the procession to the church for the funeral. I thought it was a great tribute, to us that they did do it.
Over the years, Little Africa began to take shape and grow as a community. As it did, its name was changed to what it's called today. By the 1960s, Lincolnville had become a vibrant African-American neighborhood, a stronghold of middle-class values and commerce.
Lincolnville was never totally segregated in terms of living. I can recall when I was a kid on the corner of what is now M.F. King Avenue and Lincoln Street, there were a couple of grocery stores located in the immediate neighborhood that was owned and operated by Jewish families.
Oh, we were a close-knit family of people. Now, I had fun in Lincolnville now.
We were not totally segregated. White families lived in the community as well.
It was a lot of the Caucasian kids that we played with. We used to skate up and down the streets and stuff. All of us played together, and I had a very happy childhood.
While its influence on the local economy grew, these advances were only going to go so far in the face of segregation.
Well, shopping downtown, black people couldn't try on hats, and they couldn't try on the dresses and things. You just have to guess what your size was. You look at the hat, if you like it, you bought it and whatever, but you couldn't try it on.
I could not attend the University of Florida. I went down for an interview. It was very interesting about the results of my visit there. I was told that I spoke very well. That's all I heard.
Even as events in Birmingham, Mississippi, and Little Rock stirred a nation, St. Augustine's whites became more and more determined to keep segregation in place. Fearing retribution, many of St. Augustine's middle-class blacks were either hesitant or silent about the growing civil rights movement.
My father was a teacher, and he was told that if he was participating in the movement, he'd lose his job.
Nationally, the Civil Rights Bill was stalled in the Senate, with Southern Dixiecrats effectively halting the bill with filibusters and legislative delays. There needed to be a new front opened in the fight against segregation. And there was no better place to do it than in a city about to celebrate its 400th birthday.
When we return, the long, hot summer of 1963 is about to intensify. A proud African-American neighborhood must choose between freedom or security as America's untold journey continues. There needed to be a new front opened in the fight against segregation. Leading this fight would be Lincolnville dentist and successful business owner, Dr. Robert Hayling.
A dentist and ex-Army officer, Hayling became the first Negro member of the Florida State Dental Society. He joined the civil rights struggle after the dental group was denied meeting facilities at white hotels and restaurants because of his membership. Last summer, Dr. Hayling and an associate were badly beaten by Ku Klux Klansmen when they ventured too close to a Klan rally. Ironically, when the case was tried, Hayling was convicted of assault on the Klansmen. His appeal is now pending.
Inspired by the words of Martin Luther King Jr., Hayling organized local youths and began sending them into whites-only restaurants. On a hot July day in 1963, 14-year-old Samuel White, 15-year-old Audrey-Nell Edwards, 16-year-old Willie Carl Singleton, and 16-year-old Joanne Anderson went up to the Woolworth's lunch counter and tried to order a hamburger and a Coke. They were arrested and later sentenced to 1 year in reform school. This harsh sentencing of peaceful children drew local and national outrage, putting a new spotlight on St. Augustine's racial unrest.
By the end of 1963, St. Augustine was rapidly developing national recognition as Florida's Birmingham. In late December, the National Wire Service listed the oldest city as one of 20 racial hotspots likely to explode in 1964. St. Augustine lived up to its billing.
St. Augustine is merely a symbol or an expression of the tragedies that engulf our whole nation in the area of race relations.
The year is 1964, and protests have reached a fever pitch in St. Augustine.
The scariest night was when the Klans and the others were down in the slave market. They had brought in a truckload of rocks and put it in the slave market so they would have to throw at us.
It was now that Dr. King became personally involved in St. Augustine's struggle. His visit to Lincolnville brought things to a new level. Led by Dr. Andrew Young, King's SCLC lieutenants began implementing strategies to break the will of the segregationists. But even these veterans of the movement were caught off guard by the violence of St. Augustine's white mobs.
The whites smashed through the lines of officers and disrupted the march. The Negroes were attacked for perhaps half a minute before the officers could halt the violence. The march continued around the plaza, and the whites again broke through the lines on Cathedral Street in front of the Catholic Church.
Egged on by the KKK and largely undeterred by the local sheriff's office, the beating of peaceful protesters by white thugs had become a blood sport on St. Augustine's historic streets. But as freedom seekers soon discovered, even a peaceful wade-in on St. Augustine Beach turned into a free-for-all of unbridled white anger.
Again last week, about 100 civil rights marchers showed up at the public beach normally used only by whites.
St. Augustine Beach is integrated by law, by city ordinance. But by custom and habit, Negroes use a section of the beach reserved for them 1.5 miles down the same.
The special police force has employed boats to ward off the demonstrators. They also have used a solid line of patrol cars to make a divisional line between the white segregationists and the demonstrators.
Shortly after Negro and white integrationists arrived at the public beach, white segregationists appeared.
Then the quiet beach has given way to violence.
They attacked the integrationists with their fists before Florida state troopers could prevent the assault.
The struggle for civil rights has reached a tipping point in St. Augustine and throughout America. But no one could have foreseen the events that were about to take place. A fateful swim in a hotel pool shakes the halls of power in Washington, D.C. as America's untold journey continues.
We are seeking to make this, the oldest city in the United States, one of the most democratic cities in the United States.
On June 18th, SCLC associate J.T. Johnson hatched a plan at the Monson Motor Lodge. The Monson was the site of frequent protests. Hotel manager James Brock was all too willing to have protesters jailed.
The brief calm was shattered by another demonstration at the Monson Motor Lodge, the wildest in over a week. As the St. Johns County Grand Jury prepared its long-awaited recommendations, a group of 70 white and Negro demonstrators, including 15 rabbis from New Jersey, showed up at the motel to pray. They were met by the establishment's owner, James Brock.
You're on private property, and I'm ordering you to leave this place here.
JT's plan was simple. He asked a friend of the cause, Al Lingo, to check into the hotel. Because Al was white, there were no problems at the front desk.
And at the motel, 2 white men had registered as guests. Another group of Negroes showed up, and as you see, were turned away.
Al then put on his swim trunks and jumped into the hotel pool. The rules allowed guests to invite friends in, so J.T. Johnson and several others dove in as Al's guests. While it's safe to assume that the water was fine, James Brock, on the other hand, was not. With several dozen witnesses, sheriff's deputies, and an army of photographers on hand, an enraged James Brock emerged and began pouring muriatic acid pool cleaner into the pool and on the swimmers. This act of wanton hate immediately changed the game.
Our whole foreign policy and everything else go to hell over this. Yesterday in the swimming pool in St. Augustine, they jumped in and police jumped in, their clothes on, they started pouring acid in the pool. I saw that on television.
The pictures were damning. The call for change became overwhelming, giving President Johnson the needed public support to help break the Senate filibuster. And then, a mere 2 weeks later, after years of murder, broken bodies, and blood on the streets, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law.
The purpose of this law is simple. It does not restrict the freedom of any American. It does say that there are those who are equal before God shall now also be equal in the polling booths, in the classrooms, in the factories, and in hotels and restaurants and movie theaters and other places that provide service to the public.
And the city that began 450 years ago as a voyage from Spain, whose multiracial citizens worked together for common cause, has almost journeyed full circle.
Look back and appreciate where you have come from and extend your hand to try to help someone back there to come up to where you are. But never forget to look back and appreciate where you have come from.
James Clyburn said it best. America's history is not on a linear plane, it's on a pendulum. And so we have to do what we have to do to keep it swinging in the direction that works for most and all Americans.
History is what it is. We can't go back and change it, but we can learn from it and then move forward and make it a better world for everybody.
We hope you've enjoyed our journey. And we hope this program will help people think differently about America and its true heritage. Our country was built by daring, courageous, and diverse people from all around the world. And free African-American men and women played an important role. Their struggles and triumphs spanned over 4 centuries, beginning in Florida of the 1500s, and continue to enrich the tapestry of American life, and is a history that should be remembered and celebrated. For America's Untold Journey, I'm Jason Allen Carvell. Thanks for joining us.